Page 212. Recording of a high-level Trump campaign foreign policy advisor by CHS-1 on September 1, 2016. In addition to the 4 recordings CHS-1 made of meetings with Page, CHS-1 also recorded a breakfast meeting he or she had in early September 2016 with a high-level Trump campaign foreign policy advisor, Trump Senior Foreign Policy Advisor 1, who was not a subject of the FBI's investigation. Page 213. As CHS-1 had a background in policy development through his or her work in several presidential administrations and campaigns, it was not unusual for CHS-1 to request a meeting with Trump Senior Foreign Policy Advisor 1. A prospective meeting between the two had been discussed beforehand during CHS-1's first meeting with Page, who encouraged CHS-1 to have such a meeting. And this meeting occurred approximately 10 days after CHS-1 first met with Page. FBI records reflect that, prior to the meeting, there had been discussion among FBI personnel about the sensitivities surrounding meeting with a high-level campaign figure and the need to ensure the conversation would remain focused on topics relevant to the main purpose of the Crossfire Hurricane investigation, namely whether there was evidence of collusion between Russian officials and persons associated with the Trump campaign. Those discussions also covered the possibility that the conversation between CHS-1 and the foreign policy advisor might digress into campaign strategy and tactics, with the FBI personnel involved in the discussions expressing concern that such topics were to be avoided if at all possible. We note that Crossfire Hurricane investigators properly recognized that other sensitive topics unrelated to the Crossfire Hurricane investigation might come up in the conversation, given CHS-1's background and the Trump Senior Foreign Policy Advisor 1's position in the Trump campaign. Although there were a number of topics covered by CHS-1 and Trump Senior Foreign Policy Advisor 1 that were unrelated to Crossfire Hurricane, they also discussed several matters that were directly relevant to the investigation. At one point during the conversation, CHS-1, while referencing his or her prior experience in presidential campaigns, stated, CHS-1, "We are accused of having an October surprise. What do you guys got going? You have WikiLeaks out there." Advisor, "We have a lot hanging over our heads. September 13, State Department has to produce those emails. That's a big deal." CHS-1, "You can do something with that?" Advisor, "Absolutely." Page 214. This portion of the conversation appears to have been intended to elicit information from Trump Senior Foreign Policy Advisor 1 about any knowledge the advisor had regarding WikiLeaks disclosures of DNC-related emails and the Russians. Trump Senior Foreign Policy Advisor 1, however, did not touch on WikiLeaks in their response to CHS-1's questions, instead focusing on a then upcoming public release of former Secretary Clinton's emails by the State Department. Trump Senior Foreign Policy Advisor 1 told CHS-1 that the campaign could absolutely make use of those soon-to-be released documents. Trump Senior Foreign Policy Advisor 1's response to CHS-1's question about the WikiLeaks issue was not mentioned in any of the FISA applications, even though the WikiLeaks disclosures, believed to have been facilitated by Russian intelligence services, intrusions into the DNC computers, were mentioned in all 4 FISA applications. Later in the conversation, CHS-1 and Trump Senior Foreign Policy Advisor 1 briefly discussed WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange and then discussed possible Russian influence on the election. The following exchanges took place. CHS-1, "The front page of the New York Times is about Julian Assange. What can you do to offset their worry about Russian influence in the Trump campaign?" Advisor, "To the average voter, it's a non-starter. In this city, it's a big deal. New York big deal. From the perspective of the average voter, there is no connection." And then another exchange. Advisor, "About Russian influence. We need to raise the level of abstraction to discuss the security of voter interaction. It is up to each state to provide security. Make sure every state has a security system." CHS-1, "What I am concerned with is the impression that Russia has a hand in what we're doing. Carter Page, for example, he made a speech in Moscow I know you are familiar with, and there was a tilt in the speech that was alarming." Advisor, "It's important to you and me, but not the campaign, except to say no interference in our electoral process." Although this portion of the recorded conversation covered topics which were of interest to the Crossfire Hurricane investigators, Julian Assange, Russian influence, and Page's speech at the New Economic School, There was nothing said or discussed by Trump Senior Foreign Policy Advisor 1 regarding any of these issues that would evidence any type of assistance being provided by the Russians to the Trump campaign. Page 215. In fact, even though these issues were raised by CHS-1, the advisor did not engage on the prompts or baited statements advanced by CHS-1 to spark confirmation of Russian assistance to the Trump campaign. Again, however, even though this recorded conversation was with a senior foreign policy advisor to the campaign, and the tenor of the conversation between CHS-1 and the advisor provided no indication of assistance being provided to the campaign by the Russians, there is no mention of this meeting nor of anything said by Trump Senior Foreign Policy Advisor 1 at the meeting in any of the page 5's applications. Indeed, based on our collection of pertinent FBI records, the actual results of this meeting do not appear to have been memorialized by the FBI in an FBI FD 302 or other substantive report. Recordings of George Papadopoulos by FBI, UCEs, and CHS-1. In addition to its recordings of meetings between CHS-1 and Page and CHS-1 and the Trump Senior Campaign Foreign Policy Advisor, the Crossfire Hurricane investigators also used CHS-1 to record 2 meetings with Trump Campaign Foreign Policy Advisor Papadopoulos, whose statements to the Australian diplomats formed the predication cited in the FBI opening communication for the Crossfire Hurricane investigation. Papadopoulos had been announced as a Trump Campaign Foreign Policy Advisor at the same time as Page in late March 2016. Subsequent to his or her initial meetings with Page on August 20, 2016, CHS-1, whose experience and credentials regarding foreign policy and presidential campaigns are noted above, arranged for Papadopoulos to visit him or her on September 2016 to discuss the possibility of Papadopoulos writing a research paper on oil, gas, and energy-related issues, these fields having been noted as areas of Papadopoulos' expertise when he was announced as one of the Trump campaign's foreign policy advisors. Additionally, in connection with CHS-1's 2 meetings with Papadopoulos, 2 FBI undercover employees, UCE-1 and UCE-2, also met and had a total of 3 conversations with Papadopoulos in September 2016, 2 of which were recorded. 2 of these meetings occurred in a foreign country, and the other occurred while Papadopoulos was going to meet with CHS-1. When interviewed by the office, UCE-1 was certain that nothing of substantive value was said to him or her by Papadopoulos. Page 216. According to UCE-1, unprompted, Papadopoulos identified himself as a Trump campaign advisor, and almost immediately after they began talking and showed him or her a picture of Trump and himself. Papadopoulos also told UCE-1 that he was traveling to meet an individual who UCE-1 subsequently learned was CHS-1. UCE-1 and Papadopoulos had a general conversation about the media reports involving Trump and Russia. While UCE-1, recalling that Papadopoulos laughed off such reports, UCE-1 recalled that Papadopoulos made no mention of Russian election interference efforts during their conversation. UCE-1 met later with the Crossfire Hurricane investigators and briefed them on the conversation she had with Papadopoulos. She did not write a report regarding the encounter with Papadopoulos, explaining that it was common in UCE-1's experience that a case agent would be briefed on the details of the meeting, and the case agent was then responsible for writing a report of the meeting. UCE-1 advised that she had never seen any write-up or report of his or her meeting with Papadopoulos. On September 14, 2016, Papadopoulos first met with UCE-2, who was posing as an assistant to CHS-1. During this conversation, which UCE-2 recorded, Papadopoulos provided UCE-2 with biographical type information as well as background information concerning his role in the Trump campaign. Papadopoulos also bragged to UCE-2 that since his initial selection as a campaign advisor, his position in the campaign shifted higher due to campaign management changes. He was with Trump all the time. He was famous, and his name now was global. One exchange between Papadopoulos and UCE-2 was of particular significance regarding Russia. George Papadopoulos: the only thing I can do is any business in Russia. George Papadopoulos: the only thing I can't do is any business in Russia right now. Russia has become like a hectic country with the campaign and all the other things. UCE-2: on what campaign? George Papadopoulos: Putin says he's like Trump. Trump says he likes Putin. UCE-2: oh, yeah, and that's a problem? George Papadopoulos: it shouldn't be, But if I do business, I will give you an example. I was supposed to speak at the largest energy conference in Russia later this month. It is so difficult in the U.S. politically right now, so I can do any country except Russia. Page 217. UCE2. Why is it a problem if you want to build bridges to Russia? Why give him, Trump, a hard time about it? George Papadopoulos. As you said, he wants to build bridges. The media is saying he's bad. What's important is to deal with Russia. UCE2. Have you ever been to Russia? George Papadopoulos. No. The following day, September 15, 2016, Papadopoulos met twice with CHS-1. During the first part of their conversations with CHS-1 recorded at the direction of the Crossfire Hurricane investigators, they discussed a variety of topics, including a proposal that CHS-1 made to pay Papadopoulos $3,000 to write his research paper on oil and energy involving Cyprus, Turkey, Greece, Russia, and Syria. After advising Papadopoulos that he or she had met with the Trump campaign senior foreign policy advisor, CHS-1 discussed his or her admiration for Trump's realistic view of Russia. The two then discussed other world affairs involving China, North Korea, and Japan. Following those discussions, the conversation moved to the campaign when, in an apparent reference to the WikiLeaks disclosures of DNC emails, CHS-1 asked Papadopoulos, do they have more? In response, Papadopoulos said, public statements of Assange has stated that get ready for October. Whatever that means, no one knows, but, end quote. Later in the conversation, in an apparent reference to an October surprise, the following exchange occurred. CHS-1, we were frightened to death about those surprises in 1980. George Papadopoulos, laughing, Hillary is not that bad, but hopefully for her, it is a catastrophe along those lines, and it likely will. CHS-1, yeah. George Papadopoulos continues, you know, a lot of dirt has come out on the Clinton Foundation. CHS-1, do you think that's when it will happen? Page 218. George Papadopoulos, it could be that. It could be about her health. CHS-1, yeah, that's right. It could be about her health. Papadopoulos, it could be about her health. CHS-1, release that story, so this is UI. George Papadopoulos, but it could be, you know, she falsified information. Her doctors, they colluded with the campaign. Who knows when it may be, but the CEO of the Clinton Foundation just yesterday released a statement that, yes, we did provide access for high bidders to the State Department. She's just digging a grave for herself. CHS-1, her grave? Papadopoulos, yeah. That's why I think, and this other person, and the CEO of the Clinton Foundation came out with a statement that, yes, we're indirectly guilty of providing access to the State Department for the high-level donors to our foundation. Later in the conversation, CHS-1 and Papadopoulos discussed what Papadopoulos described as an invitation from the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs to speak in Russia, which he turned down because it's just too sensitive. Advisor on the campaign trail, especially with what is going on with Paul Manafort. So, I mean, the man lost his job essentially over media allegations, whether they were warranted or not, or unwarranted. Papadopoulos also mentioned another reason for him not going to Russia and discussed Page, George Papadopoulos. So the last thing they needed at that time was, now he's going. Carter Page, I think, was in Russia, though. Papadopoulos, the entire Trump campaign is in Moscow within 2 weeks of each other, and now Mr. Trump is talking about how he adores his relationship with Putin. So, that's the last thing we want to happen. And he laughs. CHS-1, Carter is still maintaining relations with the Russians. Papadopoulos, I don't know, and to be honest, I don't know what Carter has told you or what another campaign foreign policy advisor has told you, but Carter has never actually met Trump. I know he hasn't actually advised him on Russia. He might be advising him indirectly through another Trump foreign policy advisor or CHS-1, yeah. George Papadopoulos, but the media made a whole fuss about that's not the reality. Page 219. A short time later, Papadopoulos described Page as a very nice guy, very smart. At no time during this conversation did Papadopoulos mention anything about any support being provided by Russia to the Trump campaign, even when the discussion turned to Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. None of the statements made by Papadopoulos during his first meeting, including the aforementioned subjects of Assange, WikiLeaks, Page, and the prospect of some October surprise, were referenced in the FISA applications. Later that day, however, in the second meeting between CHS-1 and Papadopoulos, there was an explicit discussion about the allegation which predicated the opening of Crossfire Hurricane investigation. the Crossfire Hurricane investigative team's interpretation of that conversation as included in the initial and subsequent page FISA applications is unsettling. Shortly after the meeting began, the two engaged in a discussion about the recent publication of DNC emails by WikiLeaks. CHS-1. I was going to ask you, did you guys have any idea that, about the DNC leaks? Papadopoulos, oh no. CHS-1, because I thought that was a really significant thing. Papadopoulos, and no one has proven that the Russians actually did the hacking. After briefly discussing the possibility and other countries being involved in the DNC computer intrusion, the discussions continued. CHS-1. So actually, what you're saying to me is that you didn't feel like the campaign was able to benefit at all from what the Russians could help with. Papadopoulos, what do you mean by, and then something unintelligible? CHS-1, well, I think this is a time when, given Hillary's weakness and given her strengths, that help from the third party like WikiLeaks, for example, or some other third party like the Russians could be incredibly helpful. It makes all the difference. Papadopoulos, well, as a campaign, of course, we don't advocate for this type of activity because at the end of the day, it's illegal. First and foremost, it compromises the U.S. national security, and third, it sets a very bad precedence. CHS-1, yeah. Papadopoulos, so the campaign does not advocate for this, nor does it support what is happening. The indirect consequences are out of our hands. CHS-1, yep. Page 220. Papadopoulos, that's the best way I can, CHS-1, but Papadopoulos then says, for example, our campaign is not, he's laughing, engage or reaching out to WikiLeaks or to whoever it is to tell them, please work with us, collaborate, because no one does that. CHS-1, yeah. Papadopoulos, unless there's something going on that I don't know, which I don't, because I don't think anybody would risk their life potentially going to prison over doing something like that. Because at the end of the day, it's an illegal activity. Espionage is treason. CHS-1, yeah, well, particularly involvement with American elections. Papadopoulos, especially if somebody is collaborating with X group that no one yet knows who they are. CHS-1, yeah. Papadopoulos, then, that's why, it became a very big issue when Mr. Trump said, Russia, if you're listening, do you remember? CHS-1, yeah, I remember that comment, yeah. Papadopoulos, and if we had to retract it, because of course he didn't mean for them to actively, and he's laughing, engage in espionage, but the media then took it and ran with it. Finally, toward the end of the conversations, CHS-1 broached the subject one more time with Papadopoulos. CHS-1, well, I'm happy to hear from you that, that there has been no interference in the campaign from outside groups like WikiLeaks or any of these people. Papadopoulos, no, and to run a shop like that, of course it's illegal. No one was looking to obviously get into trouble like that. And as far as I understand, that no one's collaborating. There's been no collusion, and it's going to remain that way. This conversation, Papadopoulos clearly stated at several points that he was not aware of the Trump campaign working or collaborating with the Russians in any manner. In fact, he stated 3 times that such activity by the campaign would be illegal. These statements directly contradict the underlying premise of the Crossfire Hurricane investigation, namely that members of the Trump campaign might be or were colluding with the Russians regarding the release of information detrimental to the Clinton campaign. These were direct, explicit denials by Papadopoulos of the otherwise vague statements to the Australian diplomats about Russian assistance in the campaign. Statements that Australia conveyed may have come from public sources. Page 221. As previously discussed, these statements were used to predicate Crossfire Hurricane, the active investigation of unknown members of the presidential campaign. Significantly, these explicit recorded denials of Trump campaign involvement with the Russians came after the initial meeting between Page and CHS-1 on August 20, 2016, and after the September 1, 2016 meeting between CHS-1 and the Trump campaign senior foreign policy advisor, both of which were recorded at the direction of the FBI and were in the possession of the Crossfire Hurricane investigators. In this conversation with CHS-1, Papadopoulos clearly said that such assistance from the Russians would be illegal. This was arguably the most significant information the FBI had gathered after approximately 6 weeks of investigative effort to evaluate the information it had received from Australia. Yet the FBI chose to discount the information and assess it to mean the opposite of what was explicitly said. As reflected in the OIG review, the FBI chose to adopt an interpretation of Papadopoulos' denials of any knowledge of the Trump campaign's involvement with the Russians in connection with the DNC computer intrusion and subsequent publication of certain DNC emails as being weird, rote, canned, and rehearsed. They described Papadopoulos as having, quote, a free-flowing conversation, end quote, with the CHS that changed, quotes, to almost a canned response, end quote. Other comments made to the OIG by Crossfire Hurricane investigators included that the perceived change in tone of the conversation may have been an indication that Papadopoulos had been coached by legal advisors to provide certain responses to CHS-1, notwithstanding the lack of an actual evidence to support such a conclusion. In interviews conducted by the office, 2 Crossfire Hurricane investigators gave similar responses to what they previously told the OIG. One agent stated that Papadopoulos' emphatic response to CHS-1's statement of a possible connection between the Trump campaign and the Russians was curious, so much so that there was a consensus view that Papadopoulos' response may have been rehearsed and was therefore not authentic. Another Crossfire Hurricane investigator briefed several FBI executives regarding this issue, including Deputy Director McCabe, Assistant Director Priestap, General Counsel Baker, Section Chief Maffa, and the Deputy Director Special Counsel Lisa Page, noting that the general consensus of the group after the briefing was that one of the statements made by Papadopoulos in his meeting with CHS-1, which would normally be considered exculpatory, was instead assessed as an outlier and intentionally scripted by him to give false impression. Our investigators listened very carefully to this recording and did not detect any change in Papadopoulos' tone of voice when he made these statements to CHS-1, as the Crossfire Hurricane investigators' interpretation of Papadopoulos' actual words was the exact opposite of what he said. And given how critical those words were to an objective assessment of the relationship between the Trump campaign and Russia, the entire exchange between Papadopoulos and CHS-1 should have been brought to the attention of the OI attorneys working with the Crossfire Hurricane personnel on the page FISA application, page 222. The FBI, however, failed to do so at the same time, and as a consequence, the FISC also was not advised of the exculpatory statements. Indeed, these statements were only brought to the attention of the FISC more than 2 years later, on July 12, 2018, when the department submitted a filing with the court pursuant to the requirements of Rule 13. Rule 13 of Rules of Procedure for the United States Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, as promulgated under Title 50 United States Code Section 1803G. Importantly, these exculpatory statements were made by Papadopoulos more than a month before the initial page FISA application was submitted to the FISC. Thus, at the time Papadopoulos made the recorded statements, the Crossfire Hurricane investigators were actively involved, or soon to be involved, in drafting an updated application asserting that there was probable cause to believe that Page was an agent of foreign power. Further, one Crossfire Hurricane investigator told the OIG that discussion of the September 15, 2016 meeting between CHS-1 and Papadopoulos and the interpretation of Papadopoulos' denials of cooperation with the Russians remained a topic of conversation for days afterward. Yet the FBI failed to apprise OI, and therefore the FISC, of those significant statements. Finally, with respect to Papadopoulos' denial of any knowledge of a relationship between the Russians and the Trump campaign, it does not appear that the FBI gave any serious thought to simply interviewing him to resolve the discrepancy between his unambiguous statements to CHS-1 and that the Australian officials had reported concerning a suggestion, in quotes, regarding possible Russian assistance to the Trump campaign. Thus, an opportunity to potentially resolve any underlying national security concern early on was missed. Page 223. Recordings of Papadopoulos by CHS-2. In addition to the recorded meetings Papadopoulos had with CHS-1 and the FBI UCEs during his trip to meet with CHS-1, he also had numerous conversations which were recorded at the FBI's direction with a second CHS-2. CHS-2 was a longtime acquaintance of Papadopoulos. For the first recorded conversation with CHS-2, which occurred on October 23, 2016, until the last recorded conversation, which occurred on May 6, 2017, CHS-2 made a total of 23 separate recordings for the FBI. CHS-2 challenged Papadopoulos with approximately 200 prompts or beta statements, which elicited approximately 174 clearly exculpatory statements from Papadopoulos, while their recorded conversations totaled 120 hours and 17 minutes, covering a wide variety of topics, many of which did not relate to the Crossfire Hurricane investigation. There were a number of conversations that were particularly relevant. Indeed, over the course of their recorded meetings, Papadopoulos repeatedly denied that he, the Trump campaign, and Russia had some type of cooperative relationship. However, as with the statements Papadopoulos made in his monitored conversations with CHS-1, none of Papadopoulos' exculpatory statements to CHS-2 regarding his lack of knowledge of assistance from the Russians to the Trump campaign were included in the succeeding page FISA renewal applications. A long footnote on this page, footnote 1328. Says see redacted OIG review at 233. The OIG report notes that similar denials made by Papadopoulos in interviews he conducted with the FBI were included in the second and third FISA renewals. However, these denials, submitted as footnote 4 to the two renewals, contained qualifying language regarding the denials. While noting that during his interviews with the FBI, Papadopoulos had denied discussing anything related to Russia during his meetings with the Australian officials, the footnote also contained the FBI's belief that the interview responses to FBI questions by Papadopoulos regarding these denials were misleading and incomplete. With regard to misleading and incomplete information being provided to the FBI, Papadopoulos was subsequently charged in a one-count information with and convicted of making false statements in violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 101A2. United States v. George Papadopoulos, CRIM, CRM. Specifically, during his first interview with the Crossfire Hurricane agents on January 27, 2017, Papadopoulos told the agents about an individual associated with a London-based entity who had told him about the Russians having dirt on Clinton. Although Papadopoulos provided the FBI with the name of the individual and where he could be contacted, Papadopoulos lied to the agents about when he had received the information. It was received after, not before, he was named a foreign policy advisor to the Trump campaign, and he downplayed his understandings of the individual's connection to Russian government officials. U.S. v. Papadopoulos, Document 19, Statement of Offense at 1-2. In addition, Papadopoulos misled the agents about his attempt to use the individual and a female associated with that person to arrange a meeting between the Trump campaign and Russian government officials. Ultimately, Papadopoulos pleaded guilty to making false statements. On multiple occasions, he then met with, answered questions for, and provided information to the government, and eventually was sentenced to 14 days incarceration. Page 224. On October 29, 2016, in a conversation with CHS-2 that occurred approximately 1 week after the initiation of the FISA surveillance on Carter Page, and 10 days before the election, Papadopoulos and the CHS had the following exchanges. CHS-2, you think Russia is playing a big game in this election? Papadopoulos, no. CHS-2, why not? Papadopoulos, why would they? CHS-2, don't you think they have special interests? Papadopoulos, I do not think so. That's all. Then a swear word. CHS-2, you don't think they hacked the DNC? CHS-2, who hacked the swear word DNC then? Papadopoulos, it could be the Chinese, could be the Iranians, could be some Bernie supporters, could be anonymous. CHS-2, you don't think anyone from the Trump campaign hacked your emails? Papadopoulos, no. CHS-2, you don't think anyone from Trump campaign had anything to do with swear word over at the DNC? Papadopoulos, no, I know that for a fact. CHS-2, how do you know that for a fact? Papadopoulos, because I've been working for them the last 9 months, that's how I know. And all this stuff has been happening, over the last 4 months? CHS-2, but you don't think anyone would have done it like undercover or anything like that? Papadopoulos, when I was in Redacted, and he was like a big advisor, asked me the same question. I told him absolutely not. And he actually was probably going in and tell the CIA or something if I'd have told him something else. I assumed that's why he was asking. And I told him absolutely not. There's actually no reason. First of all, it is illegal, to do that explicitive. No one would put their explicitive life at risk or going to jail for the next 50 years to hack some explicitive. That may mean nothing. Page 225. Later in the conversation, Papadopoulos addressed the topic again in response to CHS2's inquiries. Papadopoulos: first of all, it is illegal to do that, so no one in their right mind would, right? Finally, the two discussed it one more time. CHS2: do you think maybe Russia would have done it because they could get away with it? Papadopoulos: any foreign government. CHS2: they can get away with it? Papadopoulos: yeah, any foreign government.